Time to continue our series on great moments in New Zealand sporting history. Today we're joined by Cleaver, a seasoned sports journalist who worked at the Herald for many years before going out on his own with The Bounce, a Substack newsletter in which he covers a whole range of sports with a particular focus on cricket and rugby. His long-form writing goes beyond the score, delving into the sports as culture, governance and player welfare. And today he joins us to talk cricket, and in particular the Black Caps winning the inaugural World Test Championship. Cleaver joins me now. Hi there.
Good afternoon, Jesse.
I think I interviewed you when you were about to start your newsletter. Has it been a good experience for you?
Yeah, it has. It's been fantastic. Not everyone, I guess, gets a chance to be their own boss, but I must say I've thoroughly enjoyed working under myself so far.
It's good. It's good. Someone asked me on the weekend, and I didn't have a great answer, but they said, is there anything that you would write in a Substack newsletter that you don't feel that you could write for the Herald? And it was a really good question, and I wonder if that's the case for you as well. Is it that you are writing things that would otherwise be inappropriate or wouldn't fit in a mainstream news publication, or is it something else?
It's not so much inappropriate. I think I can take a few more liberties in that I am assuming that the audience is coming to me because they enjoy my writing, they enjoy my take on things. So I can add a little bit more of a personal edge to it that I wouldn't have done at the Herald, where I would have been more buttoned down.
You can indulge yourself a bit.
Indulgent. That's a very good word for it. I don't take a heck of a lot of risks. I think in my first week as a Substack newsletter, I had a legal threat. An email landed in my inbox with all rights reserved at the top, which is never a great sign. So I don't want to pay the indemnity insurance, so I'm relatively careful in that respect. But I mean, you should be anywhere.
Well, and hard to imagine many media companies in 2024 going all the way to fight back against a suit that's usually kind of settled quietly and or at least just apologise quickly. Anyway, not to speak for any media companies who might have a different approach. Let's talk about the World Test Championship, which I must admit, and I'm a sort of I love cricket when I'm watching it. I don't really follow it when I'm not. But it came as a bit of a surprise to me that this even existed. I think a lot of New Zealanders were the same. So where did it come from?
Yeah, well, it came really, I think it was Clive Lloyd, the great former West Indian captain, who first had the idea for it in the sort of 90s. And I think Martin Crowe jumped on board as well and was very keen. And there were a lot of false starts, and it eventually got underway in 2019 with the Ashes in 2019 was the first series played under the auspices of a World Test Championship. But really, the reason it came about was to give a little bit more meaning to the Test calendar, and in particular meaning to bilateral Test series, which were fast going out of fashion, particularly in places like New Zealand where Test cricket was very expensive to put on. I think it's a six-figure sum. That's what it costs to host each day of a test.
Gosh.
And the broadcasters weren't particularly keen on it either because you had the new kid on the block T20, which fit into a broadcasting time slot far more conveniently and could be played in prime time at night. So Test cricket was kind of withering on the vine a little bit. Certainly not in the big three. Australia, India and England, it was still flourishing. The Ashes was still a massive part of the cricket calendar. The Border Gavaskar Trophy, which India are just off to Australia to play now, was still huge. But in those sort of middle-tier countries like New Zealand, South Africa, Pakistan, West Indies, Sri Lanka, there just wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for the game, and it felt like it was in quite a perilous position. And I think the number that I always go back to when kind of highlighting the disparity between the big three and the rest is Kane Williamson made his Test debut in 2010. Joe Root made his Test debut, the great England batter, made his Test debut a full 2 years later. When they meet in the first Test later this month, it will be Joe Root's 150th Test. It will be Kane Williamson's 103rd Test.
So what's the point to that? Sorry, I got a bit confused by the numbers. So explain that to me
It
again.
just means England just plays so much more
Got
Test
it.
cricket.
Got it. Okay.
England, India, and Australia play so much more Test cricket than the rest, and there was a real fear that Test cricket would simply die off in those second tier countries. So
Yeah.
the World Test Championship was a way of giving context to Test cricket, two bilateral Test series, and give them a pinnacle event at the end of it, which was the World Test Championship
And by
final.
bilateral test series, you mean one country playing against another one?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Like in a bilateral one-day series or a bilateral T20 series is just organised between the two member
Got it.
boards.
Got it.
It doesn't go towards an ICC event. So, for example, when New Zealand and Australia play the Chapel Hadley one-dayers, that doesn't carry any points towards the World Cup in
Yeah.
3 years' time or anything. It is simply a bilateral series arranged between the Australian Cricket Board and New Zealand Cricket.
So designed to inspire a bit of enthusiasm. Did it work?
Well, the jury's still out a little bit,
Yeah.
and it certainly was after that first cycle because it started in 2019, and then a relatively significant virus started circulating around the world at a rate of knots. So it was a little bit of a mess, if we're being honest, and the series were cancelled. So how it was designed was that within this World Test Championship final, each member country, there were nine that entered. Of the test playing nations, Afghanistan, Ireland, and Zimbabwe weren't included, but the rest were. So you played three test series away from home and you played three test series at home. Unfortunately, because of COVID, two of the series that were to be hosted in Bangladesh, one against New Zealand and one against Australia, they were cancelled. And Australia did not go to South Africa to fulfill that part of their World Test Championship cycle. So it this whole thing was meant to even it up and get a more consistent cricket calendar. But unfortunately for that first cycle, other events were at play, and it was a little bit messy. They had to change the point system on the fly to a percentage system so it would still be fair. And in all honesty, New Zealand benefited from that system.
Oh, well. We've had a bit of bad
Yeah,
luck in the international cricket arena over the years, so we'll take the good luck, right?
precisely.
What was the moment that we knew that we were heading into that final of the World Test Championship?
Yeah, well, that's quite interesting in itself because it started quite poorly for New Zealand. They split a series in Sri Lanka, which was all right, 1-1, but then they went to Australia with huge excitement. It was just coming off the back of that World Cup final in 2019, which New Zealand tied but lost on a boundary count back. So cricket was on a real buzz, and we went to
Yeah.
Australia with all sorts of hopes and expectations. We had a Boxing Day test scheduled for Melbourne. We went over there and, quite frankly, embarrassed.
Yeah.
The team embarrassed themselves. They played super poorly. By the time they got to Sydney for the third test, they were an absolute mess. Kane Williamson was sick. There were controversies over the team selection, and they ended up losing that series 3-0, which on the surface of things seemed to put them way out of contention for any hope of reaching that World Test Championship final. Then they went on a tear, and which was great to see. And it probably should have been how it was because they were a very good team at that point. And as it transpired, New Zealand got to their last home summer in that cycle, which was the summer of 2020, 2021, and they had four incoming tests, two against the West Indies, two against Pakistan. And if they won all four of them, they were a chance of making that final. And they duly dispatched the West Indies, Seddon Park and the Basin Reserve, absolutely smashed them. And then they had Pakistan in the first test at Mount Maunganui, and it was a real grind. Uh, Williamson scored a century in the first innings. Pakistan were there or thereabouts, hanging around. And on the last day, Pakistan were chasing 373 to win. That was kind of out the window pretty quickly, but they were still hanging on for a draw. And cricket nerds will remember this. Probably not a lot of other people, but Neil Wagner was bowling on broken toes. He was having to have needle injections before he went out to bowl, which we kind of added to his myth and legend, really, of this lion-hearted kid from the high veld in South Africa
Yeah.
who made New Zealand his home. And it came down with five overs left in the day. New Zealand still hadn't won till Mitchell Santner stuck out a big left paw and took a brilliant caught and bowled, and New Zealand won. And then they went to Christchurch the following week and absolutely thrashed a pretty demoralised Pakistan by then. I think Kane Williamson scored another double century. Henry Nicholls got big runs on one leg, and yeah, that was it. They qualified, and there was a real quirk in qualifying. They ended up with their percentage value was 70%. Australia would have also ended up on exactly 70%, except they had been penalised 4 points for a slow over rate in one of their tests. So, and
Oh,
they would
poor
have qualified ahead
Australia.
of New Zealand. Yeah, they would
Yeah.
have qualified ahead of New Zealand on countback on
Gosh.
head to head, and they ended up on 69.2%. So New Zealand qualified for the final at the expense of Australia,
Yeah.
and nobody on the side of the Tasman shed a tear at them.
Yeah, like I said, we'll take it. And so we would be taking on India in the final, and what are their path to that? Well, by the way, if you just tuned in, Dylan Cleaver on from Substack sports newsletter The Bounce, talking about the World Test Championship for sporting history today. What had India's path to the final been? Briefly.
Well, they were dominant at home. Like, unless you've been living under a rock, you would have known that New Zealand has had a fairly significant result in the last few weeks, and that ended 4,300 and something days of dominance for Indian cricket at home. So it was a remarkable performance, but that kind of home form that India had meant they were pretty much guaranteed to win all their home tests. I would need to double check, but I'm pretty certain it's also that cycle where they upset Australia at home, which essentially gave them a route through to Southampton, where the final was played. And going into that final, I would think most bookmakers, which is always a bit of a fraught discussion when it comes to cricket, but I think most bookmakers would have probably had India slightly ahead, but the fact it was being played in English conditions certainly evened it up. And if that final had been played at that time had been played in Mumbai or Kolkata or Bengaluru, I think most people would have said India were
Well, yeah.
overwhelming
I mean,
favourites.
Dylan, what chance would Black Caps ever have of beating India on a home ground in a test, right?
It just doesn't happen, right?
Yeah,
It's
well,
never going to happen.
that'll be our conversation in 5 years' time, I think. But anyway, for now, and I, embarrassingly, not quite as embarrassingly as referring to Z cars as Z cars rather than Z cars, but somewhat embarrassingly, have been telling people it was held at Lord's. It's my, it must be the Mandela effect. I feel like I can remember seeing it at Lord's, but no, it was in
No.
Southampton because why?
Well, it was meant to be held at Lord's, but because of the pandemic, they needed a bubble environment in which they could host the test. And Southampton is one of two grounds in England where there is actually a hotel built into the ground. The other one is Old Trafford in Manchester. And like, I might be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure the thinking was that the weather would be far more stable in the south of England at that time of year than it would be at Manchester, which ended up being the exact opposite.
Well, even so, they sort of did have well, I'll call this a weather plan, but probably it's a plan related to the way that cricket can sort of drag on a bit. This would be the first test, which was a 6-day test. I don't remember this either, but it's a great idea, right? It means actually the chance of it being a letdown ending, an anticlimactic ending, are much lower. Usually they're 5 days for non-cricket fans.
Yeah, so originally it was touted that the final, to guarantee a result, might go back to being a timeless test, which they used to have way back in the day. But then the point was made that, if you're trying to engage people in Test cricket and bring new fans into that format, then scheduling a timeless test might be the exact opposite of what you want to do. So,
Yeah.
so they thought 6-day test, and it was a contingency for weather, because most tests these days don't go the full 5 days. A draw in Test cricket now is actually a real rarity.
Is
If
it?
it's not, yeah, if it's not weather affected, you simply don't get draws now because the cricket is so much more attacking. The
Gosh.
DRS review system has brought front foot LBWs back into the game. The game just doesn't last and drag on as long as it used to. So yeah, they had 6 days, and boy, did they need them because the first day was completely wiped out by rain. I think they got 64 overs in the second day, 77 on the third. The fourth day was completely wiped out by rain. They got 80 overs in the fifth day, but still going into that last day, a draw seemed almost certain.
Really? Can you tell us what
Mm.
happened over those few days in the game? I
Oh,
can't
I'd
remember.
love to.
I
I'd
remember the
absolutely love
win, but I
to.
can't remember the
Yeah.
details. So yeah, tell us all about
Well, I remember it like it was yesterday, actually, because I was
You've
absolutely
got, I think,
riveted.
like this is maybe what the difference between people like you and people like me is that I love watching sport. I get probably just as excited as you do during the game, and then instantly, probably a day or two later, I've forgotten about it, and I could probably watch the whole thing again and almost relive it again. But it stays in your brain like a steel trap, and then of course you can put it in the context of every other game you've seen, and which is why I read your newsletter. Anyway, yes, talk us through it.
Yeah, it's actually a funny phenomenon that I'm better at it with cricket than I am other sports. I mean, I absolutely love rugby, but if you ask me what happened in a Bledisloe Cup test 5 or 6 years ago, I'm a bit like you just described then. I
Yeah.
could almost
Okay.
rewatch the test and relive it again. But for some reason, cricket just burns itself onto my synapses in a way that other sports don't. So
Yeah.
what happened is they turn up. The first day's rained out. It's clearly going to be a little bit damp and grey, and probably all the indications were it would be a bowl first wicket. So Kane Williamson did what New Zealand captains haven't historically been great at, and he won the toss, inserted India, and New Zealand bowled very poorly with hugely advantageous conditions. The moment just got to them, and this was the height of their four-pronged pace attack, or five-pronged actually, as it were. They had Southey right arm away swing opening from one end, Trent Boult left arm in swing from the other. Then you had Kyle Jamieson, who was peak Kyle Jamieson there before the back issues. You had Neil Wagner, who was a great old ball operator who could bounce players out, and you had Colin de Grandhomme, who could nibble it around. But the moment just got to them, and at the end of the first day, India were about 145, I want to say, for three,
Mm.
and looking very dangerous with Virat Kohli and Ajinkya Rahane, who was a gutsy little player at the crease. But
And Dylan, were you
and yeah,
staying up overnight to watch this, by the way?
yeah, absolutely, yeah, yeah.
That's, I mean, that's you do that once and it's tough, but 6 days, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, black coffee was getting a huge uh, sales spike in my local supermarket. And then the second day, they really turned it around. There was a nice little anecdote there. That was the year that Kyle Jamieson got his big payday to play for the Royal Challengers Bangalore in the IPL. And when he was, that's Virat Kohli's team. And when he was over there, Virat kept on trying to get him to bowl with a red ball to him in the nets to get some prep, but Jameson kept refusing to. And it was Jameson who kind of initiated the collapse, India's collapse. He got Kohli LBW for 44. They ran through the kind of rest of the Indian batting lineup pretty quickly, all out for 217. But even then, it didn't feel like New Zealand were on top because this was perilous conditions. But they batted pretty gutsily. This was a great Indian attack, really well balanced. They had Jasprit Bumrah, who's still around and is still incredible. Mohammad Shami, who's injured at the moment, but a fantastic bowler. They had the two spinners, Ashwin and Jadeja, and Ishant Sharma was the other seamer. And it was just handy little contributions all up and down the order. Latham got 30, Conway got 54, Williamson, I think, was one of the last out for 49. But then they kind of had a similar collapse to India. It was a very similar profile innings to India's, except we got very handy runs from Jameson and Tim Southey down the bottom. Southey sulked a couple of sixes, got 30. Jameson got 20 odd. So New Zealand had 249, and like that was a small lead. I'm trying to do the maths on it now, but I think it was a 32 run lead. India in their second innings, we're into the fifth of six scheduled days now, and by the end of the fifth day with one to go, they were 64 for two, and probably the conventional wisdom was that just being 30 odd ahead and already two down, they probably were going into that last day without the genuine prospect of setting New Zealand a target. The feeling was that they've just bat out most of the day. New Zealand might get to bat towards the end of the day, but it would be a draw. They'd shake hands, they'd share the trophy. Lovely, after the agony of tying a World Cup final and having to give the trophy to England. Yeah. I think most people
we would have taken it,
thinking that. Yeah, they would have. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people were taking out happiness insurance premiums and that sort of thing. So I think they really would have. And then on that sixth morning, Jamieson did what he'd been doing consistently during that cycle, and he went through Kohli. He just started the downfall, and India collapsed again. Probably the most significant moment of that innings, and I'm sure a lot of cricket fans will remember this. I certainly will never forget it. But Rishabh Pant, the sort of exciting left-handed Indian keeper batsman, was threatening to get away on it a bit. He had 41. He'd had a life, but he was the kind of guy that, at half an hour, 45 more minutes of him at the crease, and a victory would have been out of the question. But he skied one up backward point, and Henry Nicholls, running back towards the boundary, the ball going over his head, just took this phenomenal catch. It was, he scored a lot of runs for New Zealand, Henry Nicholls, but I think that single act is probably what he'll be remembered for.
Great.
And we ran through the tail. Southey got 4 wickets for 40 odd. Bolt got 3 for 40 odd, but it was Jamison's 2. Him sort of getting Kohli, and I think it was Pujara, who was really Barnacle-like, that started the rot and gave New Zealand a shot. New Zealand's target was 139. They had plenty of time to do it now because of that Indian collapse. The weather for the first time all week was mostly sunshine. There were bugger all people in the ground, but there was a smattering of Kiwis there wearing a sort of mixture of beige and teal and all those classic one-day strips. And
yeah,
a few of them shirtless, and there were some wobbles in getting to that 140. Latham ran down the wicket and missed one from Ashwin. Conway was LBW to Ashwin quite early, and then the biggest horror of all was when Kane Williamson, I think he was on 2, was given out LBW to Ashwin, and looked like he was just going to wander off the field in disgust, really. But thankfully for everyone, he reviewed it. It was missing leg stump, and he went on to score 52 not out. Taylor scored 47 not out, hit those winning runs over square leg, and there's that. And the changing sheds went nuts, and there's that photo that I absolutely love of Taylor and Williamson, the 2 stalwarts of New Zealand's batting, that kind of turned around the fortunes of the team as much as Southey and Bolt and those guys ever did. Walking off arm in arm with, Williamson is not the most demonstrative guy you're ever going to meet, but, you couldn't wipe the smile off his face. It's just a lovely image. And they talk about turning that into a statue potentially for Basin Reserve, which is probably New Zealand's spiritual home of cricket.
Yeah.
And Yeah, and I think it's a fantastic idea. I think it should be done yesterday.
Love that idea.
Mm.
And we won the World Test Championship.
We did. We won the Mace.
Dylan, how hard is it for a sports writer like you to work out how good the New Zealand cricket team is at any given time?
It's, well, that's a really interesting question, that, because we've been so spoiled since 2014 to this point. New Zealand cricket's history is actually relatively tortured, with a golden period in the 1980s on the back of Richard Hadley's, metronomic brilliance, and the rise and rise of Martin Crowe. But before that, it'd been fairly grim, and immediately after that, it was fairly grim. And I've been thinking about this a bit recently, particularly with the recent series result in India, which nobody saw coming, and how frustrated and how almost, it's really weird how cricket reporters do this, but how I almost took the previous 18 months personally, you know,
Yeah.
after we'd gone to that high and had won the World Test Championship, and then all of a sudden we were losing series. We lost a home test to Bangladesh. We got smashed in India in that test where Ajaz Patel got 10 wickets, and England came out. We went to England and at the start of Basball, and they gave us they didn't give us a thrashing, but they won three tests in a row, chasing down tricky targets on the last day, and it all felt like this edifice that had taken so long to build was crumbling. But if you actually take a step back and splash yourself with a bit of cold water, you'd recognise that what they're doing is still fairly remarkable. And I look at that World Test Championship team, and the batting is still largely, well, the top three's intact. Latham, Conway, Williamson's still there. But then
Okay.
you look at the rest of it. Wagner's gone. Southey's probably in his last summer now.
I'm,
Trent
I-
Bolt's gone.
I'm almost out of time, Dylan. Where does that moment rank
Yeah.
for you as a cricket Black Caps follower? 30 seconds to go. Where does it rank in terms of your greatest Black Caps moments?
I think it's the biggest moment. I don't think it's the greatest moment.
Good and interesting answer. And I'll encourage people to sign up to your Substack newsletter for more quizzical answers like that. Thank you, Dylan. Great to chat to you.
Cheers, Jesse.
Dylan Cleaver, remembering the World Test Championship, the inaugural one, which the Black Caps won in 2021.